The act of taking a stand has never been a new idea in American history. In fact, it has been one of the nation's defining characteristics. Every decade, since the earliest days of colonization, Americans have protested for just about every cause imaginable. Even before the United States was conceived, there was dissent. However, at no time in American history did dissent leave such an impact on the United States as it did during the Progressive Era. The atmosphere and circumstances of the time allowed for dissent to be carried out on a much larger scale than it ever had before. A new kind of dissent, a dissent that called for radical changes to the fundamental systems that governed America, was born out of the Progressive Era. These new dissenters took a stand by fighting not for mere policy changes, but a dramatic restructuring of the nation's political and economic systems to achieve their desires. The effectiveness of their approach to taking a stand, as well as the tactics which they used to gain political leverage, have transformed contemporary American politics and has inspired subsequent generations of dissenters to sow the seeds of dissent and reap the fruits of resistance. The American Progressive Era, spanning the late 19th century to the early 20th, stands out as a time when the lower and middle classes had enough influence to start their own revolution. Several components contributed to the formation of the ideal political environment in which such a revolution was possible. Before the Progressive Era, most Americans lived on farms, working from before sunrise to after sundown every day except Sunday, with tools that had changed very little for centuries. Just 3 decades later, America was transformed into a diverse, urban, affluent, leisure-obsessed, teeming multitude. This explosive change was accompanied by extraordinary public spiritedness as reformers, frightened by class conflict and the changes brought about by rapid industrialization, abandoned their traditional faith in individualism and embraced government intervention as they embarked on a crusade to improve the lives of Americans, permanently reshaping American society in the process. Not only did all of these factors contribute to the rise of political radicalism, but they also contributed to the formation of a society which, in terms of political organizing and the role of government, has changed very little in the past 100 years. As a result of these extraordinary changes, politics became personal and more people became involved. In the latter years of the 19th century, American society underwent a dramatic transformation as the nation rapidly shifted away from agrarianism and fully embraced industrialization and the changes it wrought. Immigrants flooded rapidly growing cities to take jobs in the booming factory-based economy. There, they faced low pay, long hours, and hazardous living and working conditions. Capitalists, the owners of business, grew increasingly wealthy and powerful, both economically and politically. Society became restless, and it seemed to many that something needed to change, lest the United States descend yet again into civil war. It did not take long for this discontent to turn into a national movement. Muckraking journalists took the lead in exposing the fraud, waste, corruption, and other evils in government and business. Reformers of the Progressive Era worked to make American society a better and safer place in which to live. They tried to make big business more responsible through regulations of various kinds. They worked to clean up corrupt city governments, to improve working conditions in factories, and to better living conditions for those who lived in slum areas. This generation of Americans also hoped to make the nation a more democratic place. At home, this meant expanding the right to vote to women, and a number of election reforms, such as the recall, referendum, and direct election of senators. Their work spurred social reformers to pressure government officials to enact legislation to solve society's problems. Muckrakers and other moderate progressive activists believed in the fundamental principles of government and trusted that adjustments could be made through legislation and reform. Through the efforts of reformers, discontent proliferated at an exponential pace, and dissent began to be carried out to a higher level. The reformers had made some headway in opening up the eyes of the public, and by 1912, most Americans were sympathetic to the progressive vision. However, none of this reform fundamentally changed the internal mechanisms of industrial and governmental institutions. The reformers' progress was soon blunted by concerns of radical activists who were worried that their country might never see the change they wanted. The threat of revolution loomed with the radicals who sought to destroy the system rather than reform it. Dissent always existed as a tool for change in the country's history. However, its practice rarely threatened the existence of American political and economic systems as it did during the Progressive Era. Up to this point, people who sought solutions to society's problems usually worked within the mechanisms of government, pushing for reform and policy changes. While moderate progressives insisted that reform was enough to solve society's ills, there was a belief that no reform went far enough in solving the problems brought about by corruption and rampant industrialization. Soon, a new radical idea came to the forefront of American politics. People began expressing their anger and distrust of America's social institutions with calls for their destruction. Many intellectuals and working-class laborers suggested that industry should be placed into the public's hands. The American Republic and the country's burgeoning industrial-based economy were the targets of large groups of radical dissenters who believed that the two were inseparable. Believing that the current governmental system could not have foreseen industrialization and its discontents, these radical dissenters favored the idea that American social systems must be destroyed and rebuilt in a way that protected workers in an industrial age. This new kind of dissent pushed the limits of what many moderate progressives were willing to do to solve these problems. Moderate progressive reformers competed with revolutionary socialists, syndicalists, and anarchists to enact their vision for what America should become. While progressive reformers felt that America's institutional foundations were sound, radical reformers felt that America's political, economic, and social structures needed to be dramatically altered. As a result, radical activists took a stand against the more moderate policy suggestions of progressive reformers and proposed radical solutions to the problems which the nation faced. This forceful stand ultimately pushed moderate progressive reformers to adopt policy stances they would not have otherwise embraced. While moderate and radical progressives proved to vary in their methods, they ultimately shared the goal of taking a stand against the inequalities that existed around the turn of the century. Through compromise, issues were eventually solved, with many of the radicals' demands being met and the American Republic still intact. While never gaining concrete political power, the radicals of the Progressive Era left a larger legacy. They showed in ensuing generations that progressive radical activism is often at the root of great social change. Activists today echo those of the past when they offer radical solutions to modern societal problems. Occupy Wall Street, Fight for 15, Black Lives Matter, Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, and the Women's March each challenge the status quo regarding economic, racial, and gender structures and seek dramatic changes to them. Like the radicals before them, the efforts of these groups and individuals in taking a stand for their radical principles have forced those in power to reckon with their demands and adopt policies they might not otherwise have adopted. Since its founding, the United States has committed itself to lofty ideals. When the promises of those ideals are not fulfilled, many protest and demand that the United States live up to its promise. These lofty ideals are powered by dissent, and over a century ago, determined to make their voices heard, the radicals of the Progressive Era took a stand against society's ills, pushed reluctant reformers to realize the need for more wide-sweeping change, and thoroughly reshaped the role of political activism in the United States for subsequent generations by emphasizing the effectiveness of taking a stand.